Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe. Very excited to welcome Forrest Hartman back to the podcast today for this special bonus episode talking about 80 years ago in film, 1941, and what is considered by many the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. How are we doing, Forrest?
Well, I'm doing great, Brian. It's always a lot of fun to talk with you, and particularly the chance to talk about Citizen Kane is a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, this is a big one. This is considered, like, if not the best, one of the 5 to 10 best films of all time, pretty much by any major critic, right? I mean, it's one that if you're a lover of film, it's hard to escape this one, right?
Yeah, well, as you can see with my shameless branding here, you know this, but I teach journalism at Chico State as my day job, and this is a film that I teach in my journalism history class. So even though our background is knowing me as a film guy and lots of years as a film journalist. In that class, I teach Citizen Kane as a journalism film because the class is about journalism history. So that'll probably be a lot of what informs my conversation today. And it is. I always tell the students, is it the best film of all time or the best American film of all time? That's hard to say, but every list, like you mentioned, I have ever seen where they try to list the greatest films of all time, and that's whether it's an international list or an American list, has Citizen Kane in the top 10. I don't think I've ever seen it fall outside the top 10.
You don't see it too often on a list. Number 97.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which when you're talking the greatest movies of all time, like, would be an honor, right?
Oh yeah.
But exactly. I mean, it's always, like you say, top 5. I think I've seen it at like 7 or 8 a couple times, but yeah, it's always up there.
So when you teach this film, do you tell your students, so if you pursue journalism, this will be your life?
I do. I say, Charles Foster Kane, that's what you have to look forward to.
Yeah. It's such an uplifting final 30 minutes of this movie.
Exactly. Do you want to die alone with people wondering, what your life was about? Pursue journalism.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about Citizen Kane for the majority of this episode, but like with some other bonus episodes I've done on specific years in film, this year I've done for their anniversaries, 1921, we talked about Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, and we did 1931, we talked about Dracula and Frankenstein, which both came out that year. So now we're talking about 1941, 80 years ago. And I thought we'd start by just talking about the 40s in general. Forrest, do you have a couple favorite films from that decade? Like between 40 and 49?
Yeah, I do. I mean, mine are probably not going to be shocking. Although I'm really old, Brian, I'm not quite that old. So there are obviously decades that I know better than the 1940s.
Yeah.
But I've certainly delved into it. One that comes to mind right away is Double Indemnity.
Yes, that's on my list too.
A film noir where really there are no heroes. And I just sort of love that about that film, which is interesting for me because I don't always love movies where there aren't heroes, where there's not an obvious touchstone, where it's just dark and nasty things happen. But perhaps it's the charm of the era, 1944. I just think Double Indemnity is a beautifully made film. It's an early Billy Wilder movie, which of course he's fantastic. And I just really like everything about that movie. It's got a femme fatale. It's got Fred McMurray in sort of a dark turn role. Just a really great film.
Yeah, Barbara Stanwyck, right, is the female lead of that. She's fantastic in it. And it's the first breakthrough movie, I feel like, by Billy Wilder. He had directed, I think, 2 or 3 films before that, but that was the one that really catapulted him. The next year, he would do The Lost Weekend, which earned him the Oscar for Best Director. And then he went on to have just one of the most stellar careers of any director, I think, in film history. Like, if you look at his films between like 44, Double Indemnity, and let's say 1960s, The Apartment, like those 16 years are insane. Like, just great stuff.
Just an incredible director. And really, when I think of that movie, there's nothing negative I can say about it. I like everything about it.
Anything else? I have a list of a few films here. I'm a huge Hitchcock fan. I'll talk about him a little bit, but his decade of the 40s put out some great work like Rebecca, Foreign Correspondent, Saboteur, Notorious, Spellbound, just like one classic after another. Such great stuff.
Yeah, well, only good things to say about all of those. I guess I would have to mention Casablanca because I'm a
I've
big
heard of that.
Bogart fan. Yeah, big Humphrey Bogart fan, and that's another one that shows up on lists of greatest American movies of all times.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're doing Citizen Kane, and since that's I argue a journalism movie, right?
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
I think I got to throw in His Girl Friday, which is barely makes the cut. It's 1940.
1940.
Yeah, I had to look it up. My memory's not that good.
Cary Grant, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Cary Grant, Rosalind Russell. And the reason I say we got to talk about it with Citizen Kane is I also teach that film in my history class. It's a remake of an earlier movie called The Front Page, which is also a very good journalism movie. That for people that really want to get esoteric, The Front Page was remade also as The Front Page. But what happens in His Girl Friday is they flip the roles. In The Front Page, the reporter character that Rosalind Russell plays, Hildy Johnson, is played by a man. And so you sort of have this dynamic of a male editor who doesn't want to let his star reporter get away in The Front Page. In His Girl Friday, they flipped it and said, hey, we want to have a little sexual tension in here. So we're going to make Hildy Johnson a woman who was actually previously married to the Cary Grant character, Walter Burns. And so now we've got Walter Burns not only wanting to hang on to Hildy Johnson, the reporter, but his ex-wife, who he's still in love with. And I just think it's a great screwball comedy, right? If you love screwball comedies, fast-paced dialogue, of course, fabulous performers with Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. And it's a movie I really like.
I love that in a journalism class, it's not necessarily focused on film, or is it both? Are you kind of teaching both film with journalism, or?
So it's the class is the history of American journalism.
Okay.
But I've structured it well to my strengths because I was an entertainer.
Because you know film. Mm-hmm.
So we basically teach journalism history with film as a touchstone. So we work our way through important moments in journalism history with students watching films. Mm-hmm. Some of them documentaries, some of them fictional, like Citizen Kane and His Girl Friday, but all illustrating interesting points of journalism history in the era. And we also, because everybody loves journalists these days, right, Brian? we talk about the image of journalists on screen and how that has changed over the years and things like that. So it's definitely a history class, and we do a lot of history versus Hollywood, things like that. But students watch at least one great movie every week, and
cool.
Talk about journalism through that lens.
I think it's so neat that you show older films. I feel like if it's not necessarily a class about the history of cinema, you might be like, well, it's 2021. Let's only show films of the last 30 years or something, only films in color. I think it's really neat that you're showing 2 films from the 40s in this class.
Yeah, well, most of them actually are older because since it's a history class, I of course contextualize everything because we're in the 21st century and say, well, look at what we're doing today and how things have changed. But most of the films are older because we're looking back at journalism history. So I pick movies that illustrate what I consider to be important touchstones of that particular era. And we have a really nice book written by a great scholar named Matthew Ehrlich that also talks about journalism history through the lens of film. And so I think it's a good class.
Well, I would take that class in a hot minute for us. It sounds fantastic. That's so cool. So let's see a couple others I love from that decade. Have you seen The Philadelphia Story? That's from 1940. I
have.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. And let's see. It's a Wonderful Life. Mildred Pierce. If you haven't seen Mildred Pierce, it goes to anybody listening to this, starring Joan Crawford. That's my favorite Joan Crawford film. I just think she's astounding in that movie. It's really great. And then in the year of 1941, we have The Maltese Falcon. Dumbo, and The Wolfman. Three other really great, important films from that year too.
That's really an incredible year in film when you think about it. I mean, all of those films changed cinema in a way.
Yeah. So I have the list of the top 5 films of 1941 for us. I assumed one of those 3 movies I just mentioned would be in the top 5, especially Dumbo, like a big Disney movie, but it's not. None of those 3 films of Citizen Kane, which was a kind of notorious box office flop when it came out, which we'll talk about, none of those films were in the top 5. The top 5 films of 41 are number 5. It's a tie between Caught in the Draft and Ball of Fire. 2 of your favorites, right?
Classics.
Caught in the Draft starred Bob Hope. Bob Hope's very big around this time. And then Ball of Fire stars Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck from Double Indemnity. The number 4 biggest hit of 41 was How Green Was My Valley, which is best known today as the movie that beat Citizen Kane to win Best Picture and Director at the Academy Award.
Right. Every time we talk about the Oscars and people thinking they're wrong, that's one of my examples, right?
Because I feel, especially younger people today, like they probably just assume Citizen Kane was this blockbuster hit and won picture, director, actor, screenplay, everything, and it didn't, which is we'll talk about.
And it's, you know, in a sense, it's a little bit too bad for How Green Was My Valley, which is not a bad.
It's a very good film. I like that film. Yeah.
But often when you hear that movie come up, they're not talking about what a good movie they are. They're talking about, oh yeah, it beat Citizen Kane. So I ultimately feel sort of bad for it. It would have been better if it just lost, because then when people brought it up, they'd be talking about its quality as a piece of art.
Yeah, that was an incredible run. Speaking of Billy Wilder, that was an incredible run for John Ford, director John Ford, between like 39 and 41. He makes like 7 films and they're all great. And I mean, Grapes of Wrath, and I mean, so many good titles around there. He won Best Director twice in 2 years. He won Best Director for Grapes of Wrath, and then for How Green Was My Valley. Inarritu did that recently with Birdman and The Revenant, but it's pretty rare. You don't see the same director win 2 years in a row.
No, very rare.
The number 3 film of the year was called Louisiana Purchase, starring Bob Hope.
Okay.
So people, I guess they wouldn't look at the title. They would just see the name Bob Hope and flock to the theater.
Well, that was an era of movie stars, right?
Yeah.
Where I mean, not that they don't have power now, they certainly do, but I think they probably had more power in that era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the last 10 years. I mean, we still have movie stars, but I'm not sure if a single person necessarily gets everybody in the theater now. I think it's all about IP and properties that we're familiar with, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Number 2 was called Honky Tonk. Have you watched Honky Tonk?
I cannot say that I have.
It's a Western starring Clark Gable and Lana Turner. I've heard that title before, but the second biggest film of 41. Okay.
I mean, you gotta like Clark Gable. He's a fine actor. So.
Yep, and this is just 2 years after Gone with the Wind, so I think like early 40s. Clark Gable is like huge. I think his name is on the marquee, and it's like, all right, time to go to the movies. But the number 1 film of the year was Sergeant York, which I have seen, which is a great film, kind of a war film. Directed by Howard Hawks, starring Gary Cooper in an Oscar-winning role. He won Best Actor for that film. It was a huge box office hit because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which occurred while the film was still playing in theaters. The film's patriotic theme helped recruit soldiers. Young men sometimes went directly from the movie theater to military enlistment offices. After its initial release, the film was frequently reshown in theaters all over America during the war as a quick replacement for box office flops and as a theme program for bond sales and scrap drives. Sergeant York earned more than double at the box office any other 1941 release.
Yeah.
So that was popular.
For sure. And like you say, a good film. But what's interesting when you list all of these sort of little known films that were at the top, it's really not that different than what's happening now. Right?
Yeah.
Because I just wrote a review of In the Heights, which I know we're talking about the 40s,
Oh,
but
right. Yeah.
great movie for people
Mm-hmm.
who haven't seen it, particularly if you like musicals.
Mm-hmm.
But it's did poorly its opening weekend. And one of the
Yep.
things I say in my review is, hopefully the word gets out and we can kind of correct this, or studios are going to have more excuses to make Kong versus Godzilla, which did not do poorly this
Yeah.
year, as opposed to In the Heights. And so, when you look at grosses, it just what people are drawn to see is not necessarily the greatest art that's out there.
When I do feel like if a movie's really great, whether or not it does well at the theatrical box office, like 10, 15, 20 years later, the movies we're talking about are the really good ones, not the ones
Right.
that were number one, the year of 2009, 2017. It's not the number one movie of the year that we're talking about now. It's the ones that have stayed with us all the years since.
Absolutely.
So this was the year of the 14th Academy Awards ceremony. Famously, Citizen Kane, nominated for 9, only got 1. Do you know the one category it won for?
Screenplay.
Yeah. So it's weird. I think this year they have best screenplay and best original screenplay. If you look at the history of like the 90 plus years of the Oscars, especially in those early years, like every year there's like weird categories. In the early 70s, like it's like a long-winded for, instead of best original or adapted screenplay, it's like 18 words long. It's like, what? And I guess at this period, they couldn't even say adapted screenplay. It's best screenplay, best original. But I watched this really interesting documentary on the Citizen Kane DVD. It's the second disc, and it's called The Battle Over Citizen Kane. And I believe it was made by PBS in the 90s. And Robert Wise, the great director of The Haunting and West Side Story and Sound of Music, he was the editor he worked with Welles in the early 40s. And he was talking about how when they were at the ceremony for the 41 films, every time they announced just the name Citizen Kane as a nominee for whatever category it was, people were booing in the crowd. Nominees for best editor, blah, 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 blah. Robert Wise, Citizen Kane, people would boo. He said that's his memory takeaway of that night. Like, what?
Which is interesting because presumably many of the people who would be there in the Academy Awards were not the big deal that they are now. Mm-hmm. At that point. I mean, they were a big deal, but in terms of the number of people attending, a good portion of those people would have had to vote for it to even be a nominee. So yeah. So it makes me think that you've got some of the William Randolph Hearst influence going there, with perhaps a vocal minority trying to shout it down. But I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
Yeah, he probably hired some people just to be there, just to boo.
It is a weird thing when you think about it. It's like, oh, we're all going to boo this film that we ultimately nominated. It's like, and 9 nominations. You could see that happening perhaps if it was 1 nomination in a weird area, but 9 nominations does indicate rather broad support of the film. Enough people liked it to get it into the mix.
Yeah, enough people I think recognized in 41 how great it was, but there was like all this other stuff going on around it, just really never had a chance in some ways. In 41,
most of it that had very little to do with the art.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see. So as I said, Best Picture Director went to How Green Was My Valley. Gary Cooper won for Sergeant York. And then Best Actress went to Joan Fontaine for Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion. I believe that's the only person who won an Oscar in acting for a Hitchcock film. I'm almost 100%. I'm pretty sure I read that. Like that she's the only actor, supporting or lead, who ever won for an Oscar in acting.
I can't confirm for sure, but that does sound right. I mean, as you know, and probably many listeners know, Hitchcock was sort of notoriously disliked by a lot of people in the industry, and I think that hurt not only his chances when it came to Academy Awards, but by association, the chances of people who worked with him as well.
Yeah, I mean, you think about his classic films like Rear Window and Strangers on a Train, and some of these films got nominated for things. Hitchcock got nominated a few times, but acting, you don't see as much.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one who got close was Janet Leigh for Psycho. She won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress, was nominated at the Oscars, but lost to someone else. So she got close. I can't believe that Anthony Perkins was not nominated for Psycho. That's like crazy to me. Like
Well,
if Anthony Hopkins can win for Silence of the Lambs, it feels like, I don't know, it's weird. Maybe because he's not in the first 30 minutes. It's like, is he a lead? Is he supporting? Maybe it was one of those where he's in the movie too much to be supporting, but not enough to be lead. Maybe that was part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, hard to say, but I do think Hitchcock's reputation and just the general feeling about him in the industry, that you'd like to say none of that really plays into it when you're voting on what's the greatest film, but it obviously does.
And Hitchcock never won an Oscar for directing. He got like a Thalberg Award. He got like in the 70s. I don't know if he's gotten it by 71, which is the timeline on the podcast. I think it's early 70s. It might be 72 or 73. But when he accepted, he said, "Thank you," and then left. Which is my favorite Oscar speech in movies.
Yeah.
So speaking of Hitchcock, so I always do like a little segment, Eye on Hitchcock. What was he doing in 41? So this is a very prolific time for him. He had just come to the States like a year and a half before to direct Rebecca, which is one of my favorites of his too. And then he did Foreign Correspondent. Both movies came out in 1940. Both movies were nominated for Best Picture of 1940. So that's a pretty good start.
Right.
And I think if there was any movie he got very close to winning Best Director for, it was probably Rebecca, because that is the only film he directed that won Best Picture at the Oscars. So it was probably pretty close. But in 41, he has two lesser known movies. The big one is Suspicion, the movie that won Joan Fontaine Best Actress with Cary Grant, his first film with Grant. Have you seen Suspicion before?
I have not seen that one. I've seen a lot of Hitchcock.
It's a lot of fun. It's a good one. Yeah, I feel like it's not really talked about in his long career. You know, it's probably considered more of like a mid-level movie of his. It's definitely not in the top 10 or anything, but it's a fun yarn. It's like, you know, it's one of those kind of simple plots. She starts dating Cary Grant and starts to suspect he might be trying to kill her. It's basically the plot. And it's really, and the ending is a cop out. Hitchcock has said so, but I won't give away what happened. The ending's not great, but for the most part, I really like that one. And the other film he directed that came out in 41 is his one and only screwball comedy, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, starring Carole Lombard. Have you heard of that film?
I've heard of that, but I also have not tracked that one down. So.
It might be the least Hitchcock movie of his 50-year career. Like, there's no, I mean, he shows up, he has a little cameo like he always does, right. But the pacing of it, the tone of it, it's way off from anything else he ever made. She wanted him to direct it, and she kept asking, and then he was like, okay. But it's one of those, he didn't come in, like, he didn't really work on the script. He just like shot the script and went on to Suspicion. So,
now you're making me feel bad for not seeing it. I mean, I have to watch it just for that reason, because I have, I don't know. He has so many movies. I've watched a lot of them, but now I feel like I have to see that to have a full understanding of his career. Yeah,
so he directed films from 1925 to 1976, and I believe of those 51 years, it's like 51-ish films. It's like, it's almost when you to do it year for year, like it's like one movie a year almost, or more than that. There were a couple years I think he would like direct 2 or 3 films.
Yeah.
So pretty impressive career. He slowed down, of course, towards the end as he was aging, as getting older. I still think his best decade for film is the 50s. Like the 19. I don't know about you, Forrest. The 1950s, not my favorite decade of movies. Like there's something kind of glossy and little family friendly about that decade. I mean, of course there's exceptions, but I love his films of the 50s. That's like it for me. If I had to take like a decade's worth of films, 1951's Strangers on a Train to 1960s Psycho, like that 9-year period is insane for Hitchcock.
Yeah, I agree. 50s stuff is great, and the decade as a whole, I don't know. I love Sunset Boulevard, which is from 1950.
That's true. That's my favorite film. So yeah, so the 50s are okay.
That's almost 40s though, right? It's only one year removed.
Yeah, it's like, well, it was shot in 49.
Yeah.
So it's removed enough. So the last thing before we get to Citizen Kane, I have a couple other things here about 1941. So some really influential, important people were born in 1941, including Faye Dunaway, Nick Nolte. I did not know that Nick Nolte was 80. Like, I thought he was like 70, maybe. I was like, wow.
Yeah, that's the movie star thing that gets it. And they always look at least 10 years younger than they are, right?
Yeah, exactly. Julie Christie, Ryan O'Neal, and Margaret, who was so great in the movie I just talked about on the podcast, will have aired by now. Carnal Knowledge by Mike Nichols, starring Jack Nicholson, and Margaret is great in it. She's the only one who got a nomination at the Oscars. And I'm like, oh, and Margaret? Like, when I think of her, I think of like Grumpy Old Man and Viva Las Vegas. I'm like, she got nominated for 2 Oscars. She was also nominated for Tommy from 75. She is like insanely good in Carnal Knowledge, which I talked about just recently. Let's see. Stephen Frears, director Stephen Frears, and Christoph Kieslowski, David Warner, Peter Coyote, Sally Kirkland, all born in 1941. And then major film debuts that year included Eva Gabor, Jackie Gleason, Charlton Heston, his first major film called Peer Gynt. Why aren't we talking about Peer Gynt? We should do a bonus episode on that. Yep. I don't know. Maybe it's good. Let's see. Deborah Kerr, Bruce Lee, Donna Reed, Frank Sinatra, Teresa Wright, Norman Lloyd, who we just lost. What was he? 106, I think. He just passed away earlier this year at age 106. Also known for working with Hitchcock. He's very memorable in Saboteur, which came out in 42. And then Agnes Moorehead's film debut in Citizen Kane, an actress I was aware of. I did not know this was her first movie. She's so great at the beginning of this movie. Yeah. So that takes us to Citizen Kane for us. So let's just kind of talk about this movie or our thoughts on it. Do you remember the first time you saw it? Like, did you see it when you were younger? Did you see it when you were more of an adult? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, I was an adult, but I saw it many decades ago now. I mean, I'm 53, and I'm trying to, probably the first time I saw it, I was around 30.
Okay.
And I think I may have seen it in relation to just doing some film studies. You know, I was writing about something and just said, hey, you know, everybody talks about this film. I guess I had better pay attention to it and see it. And so I did, but I couldn't tell you how many times I've watched it since. I'm a big film lover, but I'm not a guy who sits down and watches the same film over and over and over again, unless there's a distinct reason for me to do that. But this movie I have seen many times because, like I said, I teach it in different classes and bring it in. So I've lost track of how many times I've watched it. It's got to be on the top of my list since I don't watch movies over and over. You know, one of them that I've seen, you know, more than most. So.
Did you really love it the first time you watched it? Were you like, this is amazing?
I did not, and I got to tell you why. I think the reason is I talk to journalism students about this sometimes. I think to really appreciate this film, well, there's a few ways you can come at it. I think it's important to know a little bit about William Randolph Hearst and the history of the era when it was removed. I think that's probably the most important thing for really truly enjoying it, because so much of the film is obviously a commentary on Hearst and other characters of that era. And when I was 30 or whatever it was, maybe I was even a little bit younger, I hadn't really studied that era much. I mean, I had done journalism studies, but I didn't know as much about Hearst as I should have, and I didn't enjoy it from that standpoint. I think the other thing that can really help you enjoy this movie is reading a film appreciation book, right? When you start talking about the framing and the lighting and things like that. And I'll let you talk more about that, since that's your wheelhouse much more than mine.
Well, so I had a really strange relationship with this movie in high school. I mean, by 15, 16, I was like all in and I wanted to study film. And this is one of those movies you just have to see it. I remember renting it and I was so excited. I'm like, oh, it's the greatest movie ever. And I was an hour into this movie for us. I was like, I can't watch this for one more minute. I am so bored. Like, I'm not enjoying myself. And it took me a few years to really come to admire it the way I do now. And it really was Roger Ebert's commentary on the DVD. Roger Ebert, I don't think he pauses to take a breath. It's like every second of this movie, he's telling you like why this shot's great, why the choice of editing here is really cool, why he does a flashback here instead of a flash forward. And every scene, he's talking about all these cool things that Wells is doing, so innovative in 1940, 41. And once you look at the film in that context, then especially if you've made films, interested in how films are put together, that's where you really come to understand why it's so great. If you just put this in front of a younger person and say, here's the greatest movie of all time, watch it, they're going to be like, no, I'm good. I think you have to come at it a different way. If you just put it on thinking you're going to watch an entertaining story, not to say it's not an entertaining movie. There's scenes in this thing I love. But watching it again last night, I hadn't watched it in a while. Actually, no, I take that back. I did watch it recently, right before Mank. I watched it right before Mank, which is kind of about the making of Citizen Kane a little bit. Not as much as I thought it was going to be. But, so I have watched it. This is the second time I've watched it in the last year. But this time I watched it with Ebert's commentary, which I don't think I've listened to since I was in high school. And I was just blown away by it again. I mean, Ebert at the end of his life, he lost his voice, like he couldn't talk. Right. And this is one of the ways we can really listen to him. On DVD format, he recorded, I want to say 8 audio commentaries. This is one of them. And it is fascinating. If you're into movies, this is the commentary to listen to. It's so great. And I wrote down a few things that he talked about. But so now, at 36, I really love this movie. I appreciate it on such a deep level. I still don't think it's as fun as some of the really great classics like Sunset Boulevard, a movie that I can put on at any time and just enjoy the hell out of it from minute 1 to the end. This one, you kind of have to be in the mood for. You have to be looking a little bit closer at the technical aspects of the movie, because there are parts, and the way that he uses time, it goes all over the place. We can never be with Kane without it being like a flashback or a flash forward of like something that somebody else is talking about to the reporter. So in terms of its like structure, it's kind of all over the place. So it's not quite as like linear as some of these other films that I love when, from the early parts of cinema history. But yeah, I think this is a really astounding film and one of the most influential, I think, in movie history.
Oh, without question. Yeah, and all the things you talk about. I mean, I think Citizen Kane, to enjoy it, you have to do a little bit of study and you have to do a bit of research.
Yeah.
And as a film critic, I've always struggled with that a little bit. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I don't give a film like this the top review when I'm like, wow, there's some really interesting things going on here, but I feel like you've got to watch it 15 times and pick it apart. I
shot by shot.
I struggle with films like that sometimes because as a film critic, I always try to put myself in the position of the person who's reading my review. And I'm like, I got to be realistic here. Most viewers do not want to watch a movie 15 times to understand it or to appreciate it. While the artistry is incredible, I got to decide, is it worth it? Is it worth it to engage at that level? And I think Citizen Kane is. I think you may have seen Darren Aronofsky's Mother, which came out fairly recently. Yes. That's a film that I watched and decided, I don't think it is worth it. I went into the theater and I said, there's a lot to unpack here. Aronofsky's not a hack. This is not a horribly made film. This is ambitious. There's a lot going on here. I could probably watch this 10 times and continue to see things, but I also left going, but I have no desire to watch it even one more time, let alone 10. So that went into my review. Citizen Kane, I have appreciated more each time I watch it, and I have seen it so many times that's saying something that I'll put it on again and I'll notice something. I'll be somehow that escaped me. Right? There's this little touch in that scene that I missed, and to me that makes it a good movie, and I've continued to enjoy it the more I've learned about it. So
yeah, real quick about Mother. It's a movie I really liked at the time. I believe I picked it as the 10 best film of 2017. I mean, there was a lot I loved about it. At the same time, I've never wanted to watch it again. And I've had very few experiences in a movie theater as awkward as sitting in between my mother and my father at Mother while they're eating the baby.
Oh yeah.
Or snapping it back or whatever it was. I'm doing this, man. I'm like, oh my God. It was my dad's first movie in a theater in 3.5 years.
Oh, interesting. Well, it's an interesting film, and somehow I missed that was one of your top films, and I wasn't critiquing your taste at all, but films like that I always struggle with for that reason, right? Like I left, I'm like, this is an ambitious movie. This movie does not deserve.
He's doing something.
Well, yeah, it's like it doesn't deserve me savaging it because he's a better filmmaker than I could ever be. Yeah. But I was like, but I don't want to watch it again. Yeah. Like I'm not inspired to watch it enough to get the most out of it. And those are the tough ones for me because it's like, it was an artistic work that was interesting, but it just didn't resonate with me. So,
most years I leave that number 10 slot on my top 10 list for the film I think is flawed, that I probably won't want to watch again, or at least for another 10 to 20 years, but that I admired something. The director was taking a chance. I usually was like, The Master was another one by Paul Thomas Anderson. It was my number 10 of the year. I struggled with a lot of it. I don't love it, but there's some really great stuff happening. So number 10.
Yeah. Another great example. I mean, that's not a film that's for everyone, but it's ambitious. I think that's the best word, right? Mm-hmm. And I would much rather see somebody do something ambitious that I don't love than Kong versus Godzilla. Right? We'll come back to that's one of the top grossing films of the year, Brian.
Yeah. A film like Mortal Kombat, right? Which I saw and I'm like, this isn't really giving me much.
Also top 5 right now.
Probably, yeah.
It is. I looked it up.
So one other thing about Citizen Kane, another reason I love it so much is seeing it on a big screen. I got to do it twice in college. I went to Loyola Marymount Film School and I took an American film history class. We watched it there, analyzed it. The really bright professor, Dr. Susan Barber, I still remember her. She was great. And then there was a screening of it, I believe it was my sophomore year of college, where William Friedkin brought it to the school. Oh, nice. And he had a print, like a print copy, and we watched it. And he came out and talked about Citizen Kane, not really about his own work. Didn't really talk about like French Connection, Exorcist. He talked about Citizen Kane and its influence on cinema for I want to say it was like an hour after the movie. He just talked about how much he loved it. So that was pretty, I mean, I was like, 19 at the time. And that with Roger Ebert's commentary, I was like, okay, well, I think I can come to appreciate this.
Those experiences are incredible too. If any listeners, if you ever get the chance to watch a film and have it described by a really great filmmaker or something involved, take those opportunities.
Oh,
they're so special.
Mm-hmm. When they're not just there to promote their next film. They're like, no, I'm here to talk about a classic film that is really great. So let's see. So, we don't have to go through it chronologically, like from beginning to end, but I did think we kind of start at the beginning and then kind of move our way to the end. And what do you think, Forrest? Should we spoil this movie? Should we spoil the twist? Or should we tell people watch it? Just watch it.
Well, I mean, I think first off, I think people this is a difficult one. I think enough people have watched it that we probably won't be spoiling it for the majority of listeners. At the same time, I think if you haven't watched it, you should watch it. And I sort of hate to spoil it for those people. So
if you have not seen this for whatever reason, like just pause this episode right now. Go watch it. We're gonna go into it. So something that's always bothered me about this movie, Forrest, is the opening newsreel. I love the first scene, so atmospheric. Every shot is so beautiful. That opening minute and a half or whatever it is, as Kane dies, and then we go to On the March. And what is that scene? 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and it's just like this tool to give us exposition about everything that happened and who this guy is. And I think the payoff of it is really important. Like we cut to the news reporters or these guys are sitting around. They're like, okay, why Rosebud? Let's get to the heart of this mystery. I think you need that scene. I just think it goes on so long. And I think, like, especially for younger viewers, that might be the part that where they start to struggle a little bit. Like, what is this movie all about? Is that scene ever bothered you, or are you okay with the newsreel stuff?
It has never bothered me.
Okay.
In fact, I've always kind of liked it, but
Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Perhaps I don't know, come at it, which I really have thought about this film a lot more as a commentary on William Randolph Hearst than I have dissected it in the way that a guy like Ebert does, like you're talking about, where you're talking about the shots. And either way is a completely valid way to dive into this film, I would argue. But I think the newsreel always worked for me as a way of saying, hey, we're talking about William Randolph Hearst here. And I guess I should be careful, because well, Orson Welles has given a lot of interviews over the years, or gave a lot of interviews over the years. Orson Welles will say this is not about William Randolph Hearst.
He always said that.
That it's about William Randolph Hearst and others people of his ilk, other magnates of the era. But I think when you see that newsreel footage of Xanadu, if you've ever been to Hearst Castle, and you see some of the other little highlights of Charles Foster Kane's life that are outlined in that newsreel footage, which is a pretty nicely made little newsreel, right? It's what newsreels of that era look like. To me, that's always like, hey, we're talking about William Randolph Hearst here, and perhaps it didn't bother me for that reason, because all the little to me it's like this is what we're really doing, we're cluing you in, and for that reason I don't think it's ever bothered me.
Wells, I believe Wells said that he actually gave that segment to a real newsreel editor. Like, that's why it looks the way it does and looks so authentic, is that someone who actually had that job in the early 40s actually cut that together.
Right. Well, it makes sense, because if you ever watch any of those early news reels, no matter how depressing the news is, it's like you say, on the mark, it's like we're going to be talking about World War II and horrible things happening in combat, but it's going to be that upbeat news announcer voice, and so great.
I love the childhood scene of him, out in the snow, and we see his mother kind of looking on, kind of. Doesn't look like the kindest mom in the history of the world, Agnes Moorehead, in this thing.
Right.
One of the early remarkable shots is like her looking out on her son, and she walks over to that table. The camera pulls back, and Ebert says in the commentary, they literally built a table into two pieces so that the camera could go through the table. It's like the table's like in two parts. And then the camera goes through, and right as it goes through, they shove the table together. So if you look really closely, for like half a second, the table bounces. It's because they were shoving it together so that the camera could pass through. And there's like a long dialogue happening there. And in the frame, in the background, you can see the little boy Kane outside playing in the same shot. Just shots like that is what makes it so magical. And Ebert talked about how Wells and his cinematographer worked on making it so that there could be shots where everything could be in focus, which was something that wasn't really done up until that time. If you wanted to have two people talking in a movie, it'd be shot of him, shot of her. But now we were kind of figuring out, how do we have three people in the foreground, like the little boy in the background, the sign of the building up here, and everything you can see. They actually designed how to do that for this movie, which is pretty extraordinary.
Well, and that's where you really benefit from having a guy, Orson Welles, who'd never made a film before, right? Who
never made a movie.
For people who don't know, he was a big star. I mean, he was a theater wonderkind. People knew who he was from the world of theater. People knew who he was from the world of radio. He was a radio drama star that had many successes. But I think there is a benefit to having a guy who's never made a movie before, because he doesn't automatically assume you can't do this or you can't do that, right? Which I think all of us, if you do any craft long enough, you fall into routines, and it's sort of hard to break out, right? Break out of the box and try something different, because you're just, oh, well, you don't do that way, and you're the one who's telling kids, like, what are you doing? That's not how you do that. But the great innovations often come when, somebody says, why not? We're going to try.
Oh, this shot has never been done before. Well, let's figure out a way to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing on that documentary I just watched, it had a long segment about his War of the Worlds broadcast, and I believe 1938 it was, where everybody thought that aliens had landed on Earth and were causing explosions and people were dying. And that is one of the great stories, at least of like the 30s in entertainment, let's say. It makes me laugh every time I hear that, because people were just like, oh my God, the Martians have landed. But you can kind of see it's 38. They don't have televisions yet. They're just listening to this. And he made it so realistic. And I think that success actually propelled him to getting to Citizen Kane. Like it was done so well that really everybody by 39, 40 knew his name.
Sure. Yeah. And if you read enough on that incident, there are people who debate how many people actually thought the Martians were invading, and how I actually read an interesting analysis where some people said that, I don't think anybody debates that some people believe that. Some people turned into the broadcast and started calling in reports of Martians invading and stuff. But I read an interesting analysis that said a little bit of the backlash was arguably by newspapers trying to attack radio as a competing medium by saying, look what this broadcast did. And there are some assertions that perhaps newspapers overplayed it a bit, not that it didn't happen, but they saw an opportunity to say sensationalize the story, to be like, well, you can still trust us. We're your friendly neighborhood newspaper. So
it's kind of weird to think that like everybody was listening to that broadcast, and then Citizen Kane opens and not a lot of people saw it. Not necessarily because they didn't want to, but because it was hard for people to find it in 41.
Yeah, I mean, largely we can talk about due to William Randolph Hearst, right? And his colleagues, because I mean the film was attacked
in big ways. And Wells, he thought like, oh, if this is kind of about Hearst, like it'll bring the movie more publicity. More people will see it. And it backfired, and that Hearst had all these newspapers, refused to run ads for the movie, did everything he could to stop the movie from coming out, tried to get the negative destroyed, right? And like Wells is over here like, I just want my movie to open. It's like, geez, crazy.
Well, and I saw a commentator, I wish I could remember who it was, that said something along the lines that essentially this movie in some ways could be tracked down to the downfall of both men. Or Orson Welles, even though it was his first film, because he never again got the kind of control that he did on Citizen Kane. I mean, he got to make more movies. He was still a known actor, but never again was it like, hey, you got carte blanche, make whatever movie you want.
Yeah.
And Hearst, because Charles Foster Kane is not a likable guy, and a lot of people came to see William Randolph Hearst as Charles Foster Kane, which isn't completely fair, but I mean, I think a lot of people see them as the same, and that sort of became Hearst's legacy. So there is an argument that the movie, and again, not my original idea, I wish I could give credit, but there's an argument the movie was kind of the downfall of both men, right? Some both and downward slide.
That's what the documentary talks about at the end, how it foreshadowed in some ways the lives of both men. Hearst would die 10 years later in 51. And I think at the end of his life, it was very much of what we kind of see in Citizen Kane. And then Orson Welles, it was so amazing that they would give him like just full control over his very first movie. That was unheard of for most directors who were famous and had been working for 20 years in 1940, 1941, and they gave it to him. And just everything he got a lot of control over his second film, The Magnificent Ambersons, but then he left to go shoot this other thing. And then they took control of the movie, famously deleted a bunch of it. And we only have that version now. But yeah, Orson Welles, at the end of the documentary, he says, looking back, if I have one regret, he said, I'm not word for word here, but basically he says that he wished he had just left filmmaking after Citizen Kane and done other stuff, because there was no way he was ever going to top it. And he said the next 30 plus years, he said he was 98% of the time hustling to get money here and there from people I knew, people, you know, just to make another little indie movie. And he said about 2% of that time I was actually creatively having fun making movies. And it, you know, and he said it's not a way to live your life, to just be hustling, just to try to make ends meet and get a little movie off the ground. That's not what he wanted his career to be. So it's almost like he made Citizen Kane so well that it kind of ruined the rest of his career. Which is so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of artists who do that, right? Even in music and other fields, that they start out with whatever.
Yeah,
it's such a blockbuster that they're always running to. I think of authors like that too. I mean, you know, there are of course exceptions to the rule that keep making more and more good work, but some of the ones that, you know, start out with the blockbuster, they tend to feel like they're chasing that for the rest of their career, which has got to be hard.
Yeah, and yeah, no matter what medium you're in, if your first thing is huge, you kind of feel like, well, I kind of have to do the same thing again, and then everyone starts expecting you to just deliver one kind of thing every time, and that can be debilitating for an artist, whether you're a novelist or a filmmaker or whatever. And it's those select few who manage to have a great first movie or book or whatever, and then they can maybe like break away and try other things and be successful. And that it's hard for anybody. And I mean, Citizen Kane is so brilliant. I mean, it must have been really tough for Welles, especially once he's like had a bunch of flops, you know, like in the late 40s, 50s, he's directing some films that don't really go anywhere. And it just must have, by the 60s, 70s, must just been so difficult for him to get funding after a while.
Oh, I would think, yeah.
But going back to Citizen Kane, anything else in like the first half of the movie that we like? I love Bernard Herrmann's score. I did not know this was the first film he scored. The great Bernard Herrmann, who, as we talked about Hitchcock before, he scored a lot of Hitchcock's work in the 50s and early 60s, like Psycho and Vertigo and some of those famous films. His last movie he scored was Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. Have you heard the story? Spielberg, I think Spielberg told it on the Taxi Driver documentary, that so Bernard Herrmann scored Taxi Driver, like he did the final, like, you know, with the orchestra or whatever it was, and then he went home and he died.
I haven't heard that.
Like it was like within 24 hours of finishing his work scoring Taxi Driver, he died.
Wow.
Which is crazy. But I mean, talk about a career. You start with Citizen Kane in the 40s, you end with Taxi Driver in the 70s. In between, you have all of these famous films, including much of Hitchcock's best work. What a career.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even name all of his stuff. I mean, he's just one of those guys that you think of film scores and it's like John Williams or something, right? Yeah. Like he's one of those names. You know, if somebody asked you who scored something and you don't know, like he's one of the names you throw out there. So,
oh, and that's why I was like, why did Spielberg tell the story? Because Spielberg went to the session for Taxi Driver. By 76, he was, you know, big friends with Scorsese. This was like right after Jaws. So he was like, oh, I can go see Bernard Herrmann score a movie. Cool. And he went there that night, met Herrmann, and then he died. So that's crazy. What a capper.
That's not a story you want to tell a lot either, right?
Yeah, that's kind of weird, right? You go meet one of your heroes, you shake his hand, you say, good on you, you're one of my inspirations, and then they're dead 12 hours later.
Yeah, nobody wants to meet you anymore.
That's where the next morning you're like, do I want to meet anyone else the rest of my life? Yeah. So I love his score. It's a mix of everything. It's got emotion. I mean, the emotion of the end score when we discover what Rosebud is so great. And that early stuff is so kind of creepy. But then we have like the News on the March stuff, and there's happier moments. And so he gets to kind of show his stuff there. I love the way that Welles ages in this movie. For 1941, watching it again last night, I'm just like, God, the makeup here is so great. How did they get it this realistic in 41?
I was going to bring that up if you didn't, because I think that's one of the really startling things about this film, that especially when you talk about movies of this era, like Casablanca, I said that's always one of my favorites from this era. But there are little things about it that bother you as a modern film goer, like the landing of a plane, you know, You know the sequence.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like a little model.
We're just like, yeah, it's just like, man, that's got to be the worst. Couldn't they have done a practical plane landing?
Or just a stock footage, maybe stock footage.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, that's awful. And I can't think of really any moments like this in Citizen Kane. I mean, there are sort of like special effects shots with crowd sequences when he's a politician and such.
Mhm.
And it's just for this era. I don't think when you watch this film, I can think of a moment that I'm really drawn out of it going,
Mhm.
oh yeah, well that was, it's 1941. You got to forgive him for that because like you say, I mean, Orson Welles realistically ages both from an acting perspective and from a
Mhm.
makeup perspective.
Yeah.
In a film, another film, a later film, whereas an example, I don't think it's a successful. You've probably seen Giant with James Dean.
Oh right.
He ages significantly in that film, and
Not believable.
and I like the movie, okay, but I don't buy him aging, right? Like I've never bought it. I'm like, and that's a film from a later era. So the fact they did this with Citizen Kane is very impressive.
Well, I think black and white helps too, right? I mean,
Yeah, well,
sometimes in
for sure.
color,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's movies of the last 30 years where the lead actor or actress, shows them at 80 or 90 at the end. I mean, like Winona Ryder at the end of Edward Scissorhands, or there's this movie For the Boys I watched once with Bette Midler. There's a scene at the end with her and I think it's James Caan fighting it out like before a ceremony or something, and they're in like old age makeup and they're supposed to look like 80, 85, and it looks so hilariously awful. You're like, oh, kind of ruins it, kind of takes you out. You don't have that in Citizen Kane, which is so incredible for a movie released 80 years ago.
Yeah, no,
and it's also based on how he moves too. Like we get to see him as he was in 41. We see the young 20, what was he, 25 when he made this? It's so depressing. It's like 25 years old, he makes this masterpiece. And he looks, I mean, we see him young and he looks like a young Orson Welles. And then, I mean, by the end, it's not just his face and hair. It's like the way he kind of like stumbles like Frankenstein's monster through the castle. It's so great. Like he really feels like he's old.
Well, yeah, it's like I said, it's not just the makeup, although it's outstanding. It's the acting as well. And this would be one of those things that you could expect a theater artist to get wrong too. And I'm not saying just because if you've ever spent any time around the theater, I have. Makeup is different, right? If you're doing makeup for a proscenium stage and you know that you're going to have a lot of people 50 feet away from you, the theater makeup looks kind of goofy on people usually if you see them up close. And of course, film is an entirely different medium, right? You're always seeing people up close. So to do it that well and to be able to bring your acting down a notch, from you're used to doing it for radio where you've got to really transport people with your voice probably being a bit bigger than life, and you're used to doing it in theater where you're playing to people 50 yards back. There's a lot more nuance to film, and I don't know, maybe he's just a natural, I guess, because it's there, all that nuance. It's really wonderful.
I do think it's interesting. In most of the episodes we've done for Film at 54, we've talked about makeup. Little Big Man. We talked about Lincoln, president movies. We talked about Planet of the Apes. Makeup has been a thing.
Yeah, sometimes it's the little things that matter, right? Well, what's funny, I mean, you talk about this too, even more modern movies. You've seen The Irishman, since you mentioned Scorsese.
Yeah, let's do away with makeup. Just do it with the computer.
Yeah, now the thing with acting is digital, and I'm not sure I bought every sequence with that, right? Like Robert, oh look, Robert De Niro is like 30 years younger. Like, no, he's really not. I can tell you did something digital. Citizen Kane, none of that.
It's really there. They really did it for real. Yeah, and it looks great.
Yeah.
So makeup is really great. I don't think they had an Academy Award for makeup yet in 41. I don't even think they had one by 68 for the original Planet of the Apes. I think it got like an honorary or a special Oscar for its makeup. So it took a while for makeup to be recognized. It might have even been the 80s. I think I heard something somewhere that the first makeup award was given for The Fly from 1986 by David Cronenberg. I mean, it took a while for them to recognize makeup, but if they had in 40 for 41, I think this movie could have won that. So fantastic.
10
Yeah.
nominations.
10. It couldn't get to 10,
Yeah.
right? Mank got to 10, and Mank won 2 Oscars for us, won more Oscars than Citizen Kane.
True.
That was I got 19 out of 23 right, and one of the 4 I missed was cinematography. That Mank won that over. What was the one I had picked for that? It was the Best Picture winner.
Oh, yeah.
Which I just blanked on the name. What's that movie called with Frances McDormand? Nomadland.
Oh,
there it goes.
Why am I?
My brain is just going mushy.
I was blanking on it with you. So. It's because that wasn't my favorite of the year, although it's a very good film.
So. I was like, it starts with an N.
Yeah.
All right. So what else do we love about this movie? The performances. Let's talk about the actors a little bit. I mean, Orson Welles, we've touched on a little bit. What does he do well for you in this movie? Like as an actor, forget the shots and the editing and the music. What is he doing as an actor that's really strong here?
Well, I think he does everything well, and like I said, I'm looking at it as a guy who spent not a ton of time, but some time around the theater, and looking at this guy who had done radio dramas and done theater. Film requires much more nuance because the camera very often is right on top of you, and if you go in and act in the same way for camera that you do for theater, you're going to end up sort of like with the William Shatner on early Star Trek scenario, right? Where they're often like, really, really big. Orson Welles has none of that. It's really, when I think about it, it's just remarkably nuanced acting. When I see him as a young man, I believe him as a young man. When I see him as an old man, I believe him as an old man. The range of emotions is pretty extreme in this movie as well. We see him as a fired up sort of yellow journalist going to take on the world. We see him as a broken down old man who, although he has all the money in the world, didn't get the life that he wanted, and feel and that's a pretty extreme range of emotions. We see him angry, we see him jovial, and I think he pulls it all off wonderfully well. It's just one of the great screen performances.
It's amazing how good he is, considering that he also worked on the script, he directed the film, he produced the film. Like, I feel like today, if someone were to come to me and say, okay, I'm going to make my first feature film, Brian, I am going to write it, direct it, produce it, and I'm going to be the star of it, right? Wouldn't we say, like, maybe give it to your 3rd or 4th film, like maybe figure out the filmmaking stuff first? And the fact that he's like 25 years old and he's doing all of these cool, innovative things behind the scenes, and then he's also the star of the movie, and he's so great. It's like, how did he do that?
Yeah, so amazing. I mean, obviously he surrounded himself with some great people.
Yes,
like you talked about Bernard Herrmann, and cinematographer. He had experienced people working with him, and I'm sure those people helped tremendously.
Yeah, Greg Toland was the cinematographer, and it's Ebert says at the end of the commentary, like, this didn't happen very much, but in the end credits, there's actually a title card at the end for, it says director, producer, or whatever, Orson Welles, and then underneath his name, cinematographer Greg Toland. Usually the cinematographer and the director are not on the same title card ever in a movie, but it is here, and I think Welles did that because he knew how important Greg Toland was for this movie to be as great as it was.
Yeah, and you had Herman J. Mankiewicz, which, not to open up the whole can of worms, but if you watch Mank,
who wrote this?
If you watch Mank, the argument is that Mankiewicz wrote the whole thing on his own, and Orson Welles, of course, said, yeah, that's not the case. He's a co-writer. But regardless, Mankiewicz played an important role in it. So there were a lot of great people around Orson Welles, and I expect that's how he juggled it all. But there are directors you see all the time that fail despite having really great people around him. So I don't think that diminishes what he pulled off with this movie.
He's just so great. He's so believable every step of the way. He has like this charismatic power that not every actor has. You can really believe that this guy would ascend to the highest level. Like you just kind of want to hear what he says, and the way he controls a room. It's so great. It's something that not every actor would be able to do.
Right, right.
Let's see other actors I love in this movie. So we get some female, some great female characters in this, like Agnes Moorehead at the beginning. My favorite actress in the film is Dorothy Common-Gore. I think that's her name, Dorothy Common-Gore. She's the second wife, the blonde she's trying to make a singing career happen, and boy, she struggles with with that. One of my favorite shots of the movie is her singing, and the camera just slowly pans up, and it keeps going up, 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 all the way to those two guys way up in the wings looking down, and the guy holds his nose.
Yeah.
That's all we need to know. Like this isn't quite landing. And he's like, Orson Welles so intense, like when he gets up, he starts clapping and no one else is clapping, but like he's gonna make her a star, but can't quite get her there.
Yeah,
she's great in this.
I think she's wonderful, and interestingly, not to digress, I mean, her performance is great. If you read about the William Randolph Hearst story, reportedly Dorothy Common-Gore and her portrayal of Susan Alexander Kane was one of the biggest stumbling blocks, or one of the things that most angered the Hearst crowd.
Okay.
Because she's a pretty obvious stand-in for Marion
Davies, who's in the film Mank.
Yeah, who was Hearst's long-term mistress. Really interesting story with Hearst. He and apparently his wife did not believe in divorce, so he stayed married to his first wife his entire life, although he lived the majority of his life with Marion Davies as a mistress. And by all accounts, they had a pretty loving relationship. I mean, there's a lot of rumors swirling around, but most of the things that I've heard about them is that they actually seem to have a loving relationship. They just couldn't marry because Hearst didn't believe in divorce. And there are many accounts I've heard where Hearst was just outraged that the film would have a Susan Alexander Kane character basically taking on Marion Davies. And there's also a pretty good argument that it's that if you do read Susan Kane as Marion Davies, it's unfair because Marion Davies really was not a no talent person. And as you said, Susan Alexander Kane, you get the shot, the critics holding their nose. I mean, she's really painted as somebody that Hearst is trying to make famous, but doesn't deserve to be famous. And that was not the case with Marion Davies. She was a talented screen actress who actually, made the jump from to talkies, from silent films to talkies. I mean, was not a huge star, but was a big enough star that when the Depression rolled around, she had money that she could lend William Randolph Hearst. And arguably, from many things I've read, that was one of the big things that created a rift with the film, is that Hearst heard about this portrayal of Davies, and that if he wasn't upset already, he was upset when that came out.
Do we know, did Hearst see the film? Did he actually watch Citizen Kane? I've never heard if he actually watched it.
In the research I've done, I don't think I've ever seen that he saw it. I think I have seen. It's been a while since I went back and studied up on it really thoroughly. I believe I read quotes where he said he hadn't seen it and would not see it. But those are one of those statements too. For all we know, he did see it and just. That's the public line.
I feel like he probably watched it at some point.
Yeah, but I don't think from all the reading I've done over the years, anybody definitively knows whether he watched it or not. And as I recall, his line was that he didn't. And in fact, there's an interesting interview I've seen with Orson Welles where he talks about the attacks on Citizen Kane and said that Hearst pretty obviously was against this movie, but he liked to think of himself as above the fray, so that Hearst himself wouldn't get his hands dirty and attack the movie, but that Hearst had underlings who would very aggressively attack the movie while sort of Hearst being above all that. I mean, that's Orson Welles actually said that, right? And Luella Parsons was a Hearst newspaper gossip columnist.
Mhm.
Very much anti-Citizen Kane, very much in Hearst's corner, perhaps at the behest of Hearst. But like Orson Welles said, it would come off that it's Luella Parsons making the attacks on the film, right? But she's on the Hearst.
It's just amazing to hear. It's like he didn't have anything better to do. It's a movie. like what did he think was going to happen? Like this movie would open and be a huge hit, and like his career would be destroyed or something. I mean, it's not him. It's not Hearst in the movie. If it was like, if he was literally playing, it was like a biopic or something, I could understand. But it's not him.
Yeah, you don't know.
Someone else.
And maybe it's trying to salvage his reputation, because Hearst was not at the top of his career at this point. The Great Depression really took a toll on his newspapers. I mean, there was a point where William Randolph Hearst was certainly one of the most powerful people in America. Like he had a media empire before media empires were like they are today. But I mean, he had a media empire and a lot of power. And that was reduced significantly during the Great Depression. I mean, he had to sell off a lot of belongings and things. He was always a wealthy man, by the terms of what most people would consider wealthy. But the Depression did eat into what he was going on. Davies kind of famously gave him a loan at one point, like I said, because he was having to sell off properties and things along this line. So maybe it was that too, that he's like, man, I've went through some hard times, I've weathered them. Now I don't need this film out there tarnishing my image. It's who knows.
But as I say, it's like it's not his name. I mean, I'm watching season 4 of The Crown right now. I don't know if you've seen The Crown, but season 4 goes into like the dirt and the drama behind the scenes of the Queen and Diana and Charles. And I'm like, wow, you think that like the royalty, like they would try to get this project from not being seen. And this is a project that, Citizen Kane, it's not even him. But it's just so interesting.
That's true. Yeah. And again, we both said already, Wells repeatedly said, this is not William Randolph Hearst, right? Like
it's not him.
Yeah, he said, oh, he's a stand-in for many industrialists, I think is the kind of the language he would use.
What's really scary to think about, Forrest, what if Hearst had enough influence to actually pull this movie and destroy it, where after 41 it was just gone? Wouldn't that be crazy to think that this movie would have been lost to film history? And there maybe would have been some books, some articles written about, oh, there was this film. It's so crazy to think that he wanted to just destroy this thing. And what if he had, and we didn't have the movie today? It'd be crazy.
Well, not unthinkable that couldn't have happened, because like you said, there was a point where numerous reports I've seen said he was trying to buy all the prints, but before it was ever distributed, right? That was one way he was going to try to destroy it, was he was going to buy the film from RKO before they could distribute it, at which case he could do whatever he wanted with it, right? Even if that's make a nice little bonfire
and like twirl a long mustache as like each copy is thrown in the fire.
Yeah. And we're talking about a connected guy with enough money who did have connections to the film industry as well. I mean, William Randolph Hearst had dabbled in making films, in part trying to advance Marion Davies' career, but also because I think he had an interest in media in general. So he had some connections, he had some money. I can imagine a reality where he succeeds in killing the film.
So he was just a frustrated failed actor, basically.
Hearst?
Hearst. He's like, if I can't be up on that screen, I'm going to destroy.
Well, the best of my knowledge, he never really attempted acting. It was all producing for him. But
it's so the story about the movie is in some ways as interesting as the movie itself. It's crazy. Sure. One other thing Ebert said was after 41, like people didn't really know of the movie at all until the mid 1950s. is when it started coming back into theaters and people started watching it. I mean, maybe they had to wait for Hearst to die. I don't know, because he died in 51, and then like around 55 the movie started coming out again, and it was the late 50s that it really became popular, and like, oh, this is one of the great films of all time.
Yeah, well, one of the problems too is even though Hearst media empire wasn't as large in 41 as it had been, it was still large. And it was my understanding that the Hearst newspapers wouldn't run ads for the film.
Yeah,
And
he would not have a word about the movie in his paper.
right, and at this point, television is not a player yet.
Mm-hmm.
So you have radio, and,
Yeah.
and you have newspaper. And if
Yeah.
you run a theater in a market where your newspaper is a Hearst paper, and they won't run advertising for your film, that discourages you from showing the film, right?
Yeah.
And that really happened during Hearst's
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. The film, despite having all these big players involved in it, didn't get a really wide release. And yeah, obviously that played into the fact that it didn't do well in theaters.
Yeah, theaters would book the movie and then never play it.
Yeah.
They would play another movie that could get covered in the Hearst papers, probably, like, because they don't want to run a movie for a week that no one's going to show up for.
Right.
So, I mean, it makes sense, but it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So getting back to the movie a little bit, a couple more scenes before we get like closer to the end. I wanted to touch on two of my other favorite scenes. The one where he has the big speech to that giant crowd, which the one shot we get of the giant crowd, that is a matte painting. That is not real. They did like something weird with the film to make it look like there's some movement in the crowd, but if you watch it closely, there's not. And the rest of that scene, it's all done through sound and through like cuts to different, shots of like 8 to 10 people. But I mean, you're supposed to believe it's what, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands, but it's like maybe 10 to 20 people on the set, which is kind of crazy.
And it works, right?
Yeah.
That painting works.
But I love that shot that comes in and it goes underneath Welles as he's talking, and then you see the giant poster like behind him, and like there's some like camera, like I don't know if it's like a dolly or what they're doing with the camera in this movie. Sometimes I'm just like, wow, like that. I mean, that's not something you just come in on the day and you go, okay, so how are we going to shoot this? Like that's something I think that they prepared many weeks in advance to figure out how they were going to put this on film.
Yeah.
So I love that scene. And then the other scene that I love is that earlier scene with the first wife, which is like that famous montage, right? Where they've just been married, they sit down at the table and they're close together and they're talking and they're kind of being funny with each other. And then over the course of what, 2.5 minutes, you see like every, like 6 months later, and then at the last shot and the camera pans back and they're like across the room from each other reading the paper, not talking.
Right.
That is a brilliant piece of filmmaking, that 2.5 minutes.
Sure. Well, and the table is bigger and bigger,
Yeah.
Right? Which I mean, I think it's a brilliant piece of filmmaking because it does two things, right? It shows the separation in the relationship,
Yep.
but it also shows the increase in wealth and stature and things like that. So you're getting a lot of information in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. And showing the aging. I guess they shot when they're the oldest first, and then they would take off the makeup, leading all the way into the first scene where they just look like themselves. Right. Kind of an interesting way to film that too.
Sure.
Anything I love Joseph Cotten in this movie. We haven't mentioned his name. He plays the friend. They would also collaborate together, he and Welles, on The Third Man from 1949. They're both in that too, which is a classic film of the 40s. And Joseph Cotten is one of my favorites. I feel like he's very underrated. He's one of my favorite Hitchcock villains. He's in Shadow of a Doubt from 1943. I wrote a whole like a long paper about that film and his character, and I presented it at the Thornton Wilder second conference in Rhode Island in 2015, where I outed Thornton Wilder as gay in front of his nephew, who happened to be sitting in the front row, was not happy with me for it.
Oh, he did not. The nephew did not know that, or he just wasn't happy that
the nephew. So there was this conference I went to all about Thornton Wilder. He wrote the screenplay to Shadow of a Doubt, starring Joseph Cotten, directed by Hitchcock, and in the two biographies I read and all of these things I read online, that Thornton Wilder was a closeted homosexual and it wasn't really talked about, blah, blah, blah. And when I wrote this paper, I did not expect to ever deliver it in front of a family member.
Right, right.
And I was there for 3 days for us. There were dozens of presentations. I was the only person in 3 days to mention anything about homosexuality. And his nephew's in the front doing this with his arms just looking at me like, who does this kid think he is? I'm like, sorry, I didn't know family was going to be here.
Did he talk to you about it afterward?
He came up, he said he kind of was being nice about it, but I could tell he was a little bit upset. And then like he said something later, like at the dinner I went to, like, and then some of you younger folks, you should do some more research because you don't know what you're talking about. He said something like that. And I was like, okay, that's clearly aimed at me. But I digress. I love Joseph Cotten. And this is, if not his first film, it's like one of the first 3 films he's in. Joseph Cotten's very early in his career. And he was acting, if not all the way into the 70s and the 80s. We just talked about him on the episode of The Abominable Dr. Fives with Vincent Price. Joseph Cotten is in that as well. So he was acting for many decades. And I just love his like his banter with Kane in this movie. And we do get to see him older too. He's in that famous shot where like behind him, or just like, it's like what it looks like, it's like a cruise ship or something. He's just like chilling. Right. And so I like him in this movie too.
Yeah, I think he's outstanding. I don't think I have anything really to add because he is so great. But yeah.
He's not in the movie a whole lot, but I just love his look and what he brings to a project. It's always really great. The rest of the cast, stellar. Really, there's not a bad one in the bunch.
No, there's really not. I like is it Erskine Sanford? Am I saying?
I think so, yeah.
Name right? Yeah, he's very good as Mr. Carter. So like you said, it's a good cast top to bottom. I mean, lots of great players. Not a film that you would expect to bomb. So I think we can attribute that to.
But it's a weird bomb. It's not a bomb. It's not a movie that bombed because it's a bad film. No. You know, that people thought it was a bad film. It's a movie that was hard to find in 41. Right. I think for people interested in movies.
And it seems like a movie people maybe would have gone to see had they been able to know about it, had it played near them, etc. So
like if I had been around then, Forrest, and so I go to the theater, I heard you guys booked Citizen Kane, but you're not playing it. So where is it? I don't think a lot of people were saying those things. They were like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll go see the Bob Hope movie. Yeah. It'll be fine.
It's the same as movies today, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let's get to we can talk about all the scenes of this for another half hour. Anything before like the last 20 minutes you wanted to touch on? Any other major scenes before we get to the end of his wife leaving him and that wonderful chaotic scene of him ripping apart her bedroom? I love.
Yeah.
Any scene before that? Yeah.
I think we're doing okay. I mean, this is one of those films you can name scene after scene after scene, right?
Yeah, it's hard, right? I mean, how many people have dissected this movie before us? Probably a couple billion. I don't know like how many people have talked about this movie. So, you know, I mean, I don't know if we're revealing anything in our conversation here that nobody knows about. But it's still just one of those movies I could talk about forever. It's so much fun. I did find out on the Ebert commentary that scene where he's ripping apart her bedroom, he actually injured his hand and he started bleeding. And unlike Leonardo DiCaprio in Django Unchained, Orson Welles decided not to show that to the camera, which I actually find interesting. You think in the moment he would have been like, oh, I cut my hand, I'm bleeding, let's use it. But maybe he was such a perfectionist and like that wasn't part of the plan. Like maybe because we see there's a shot where like you see him like bring his hand like behind his back, like almost to like make it so that, okay, they can't see my bleeding hand. Kind of interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah.
Like I feel like I would have been like, use it.
Yeah.
Because he's really ripping that room apart like crazy.
Sure. Yeah, I hadn't heard that. So that's a great insight.
Yeah. And I remember I'm watching that scene again. I'm like, wait, so every time we see Kane in this movie, it's told through the perspective of another character. So I'm like, wait, she left. How are we? Oh, there's like an audience. There's people watching from outside the room. And we get that I mean, that emotional moment where he finds the snow globe and he just says Rosebud, right? This is not the part where he dies. It's like he sees it, and like, you know, once you know what Rosebud is, like, I feel like that scene is so sad. And then that long walk he takes, just like a zombie, and we get the shot of the two mirrors where you see like 15 Kanes walking, just that slow, awkward, sad shuffle. And then it's pretty much after that. I mean, after that, it's pretty much the end. Like, he dies, and we get the surprise reveal.
Yeah.
Do you like the Rosebud mystery of the movie? Do you think that works?
You know, well, I think there being a Rosebud mystery works. I'm not sure the reveal is as exciting as you know, as people would hope. I think the build up to the actual reveal is
it's long,
problematic, and yeah, you know, it's a good hook, but I don't know that the reveal will get most people's juices going, because really the reveal takes interpretation, right? And we're okay saying,
yeah. So if you've made it this far, and if you haven't seen the movie, I think you would have bounced a long time ago.
So Rosebud is his childhood sled.
His sled.
Which then leaves a lot of interpretation for the audience to do on their own, right? So what exactly does that mean? Why is he thinking about this upon his death? And you know, most commonly, I see people thinking he's thinking about his lost childhood. He never really got to have a childhood.
The last moment of innocence, I've always taken it to mean, like, that was the last moment with the sled in the snow where life was innocent, life was free. And then ever since, it's just been, not to say that he's just, you know, had a horrific life every day after that. He had moments, and we see him younger when he's in his 20s, and he seems to be happy and trying to do big things. But what, I mean, any other interpretations you have or have heard, like what else that's supposed to mean besides a loss of innocence?
Well, that's the primary one that I usually hear people talk about. I'm trying to think. Over the years, I've heard some interesting ones, but none are really standing out to me, because that frankly has always been my reading of that.
I would like to hear the different interpretations. What else?
It's usually students have come up with things that I'm like, oh, I've never thought about it that way before. But you know, the thing that's interesting to me about it is that's the one place where this whole battle over Citizen Kane starts to break down for me. Is there are obviously a lot of parallels between Charles Foster Kane and William Randolph Hearst's life, but the sort of loss of innocence and the fact that he's alone and apparently not having a good relationship with his mother. You know, most people argue that Agnes Moorehead, you know, gave him away to potentially get him away from an alcoholic father, to give him a better chance at life. The real William Randolph Hearst had a by most accounts really outstanding relationship with his mother.
Okay,
they were close for many years. He did not die alone. He had children who were at his bedside when he died. And so, interestingly, the whole Rosebud idea is one of the things that does not parallel with William Randolph Hearst's life. And I guess I've always found that interesting too. It gets me thinking, and makes me think that when Orson Welles says, well, it's not only about William Randolph Hearst, that he's not lying, right? That he certainly had a bullseye on William Randolph Hearst, but that he was potentially thinking about other people too, because the dramatic arc of Charles Foster Kane has a lot of similarities to William Randolph Hearst, but they are not identical, particularly when you look at the man's the beginning of his life and the end of his life. You know, William Randolph Hearst had close relationships with people, including his mistress, including his mother, and Charles Foster Kane really doesn't, right? There's no, all of his relationships are problematic.
Yeah, but this is not a throwaway twist or anything. I mean, there's that I forgot that long tracking shot that goes over all of Kane's things. I mean, that shot is at least 45 seconds to a minute. You're seeing all this junk. And then, I mean, when he throws the sled in, and we get a massive close-up zooming in as the letters Rosebud are disintegrating into the fire, and Bernard Herrmann's score is so big. I mean, you're supposed to like have a big reaction to that moment. It's not a throwaway.
No, no. Well, and I think that shot is saying too, although it's still to me taps on the idea you said, sort of lost of innocence. The fact that it's such a long shot is reminding you, right, that despite all of these things he's accumulated, despite the wealth, despite this and that, what matters to him at the end is this sled.
Is a feeling, almost like a feeling he had when he was a kid.
Yeah,
that's all that matters.
Something that's basically worthless, right? I mean, it's the sled's not worthless, but
which I do. I've always thought that's a great lesson, right? I mean, is that the goal we have, just to accumulate things? I mean, when you go at the end, you don't take anything with you,
right?
So it's like, so I've always admired that theme and that, you know, like the ideas behind that twist ending. I do think that they have a lot of power, and I'm just, it's so interesting to me that it's not, when you first watch the movie, you're thinking Rosebud is like a person. Like you don't think of a sled having a name. So it's not something you would think of while you're watching it the first time.
Right. Yeah, and you know, and it does, like I say, require some interpretation as to what the sled means to him to get the full meaning out of it. You know, if you want to be really literal about it, you're not going to like the ending at all, right? I mean, there is an interpretation of Citizen Kane, I suppose, where we call the whole thing a gimmick, right? Looking back at his life, starting with the newsreel, having a reporter unspool his life, you know, to figure out what Rosebud means, that it's, you know, you're sort of bookending it with a gimmick. I think it works, but you know, I have certainly seen people viciously attack films that do similar things as being too gimmicky.
Have other films tried to have the same ending, like where you hear the word Rosebud at the beginning and then you wonder what it is the whole time, and then it's a sled at the end? As another filmmaker tried to do it? Probably The Simpsons.
Not necessarily Rosebud, right? But yeah, you know, Spielberg sort of famously bookends his films with callbacks and things.
Oh, right.
You know, I've seen a lot of critiques over the years with filmmakers who do these sort of like callbacks.
Yeah, in screenwriting, it's called the planting and the payoff. You plant something at the beginning, you have to pay it off by the end. And sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't work. So
exactly. I think it works in this film, but you know, I bring that up just because, like I said, I've seen people do it where I thought actually it was fairly effective, but yet I've seen snarky critics go after it and say, you know,
have you ever wondered who heard him say the word Rosebud? Like, there's no one in the room. There's a woman outside the room at the very beginning, you know, because the reporter's like, his last word was Rosebud. What does it mean? And it's like, well, he whispers it alone with the door closed. How did someone hear him say it?
I have not wondered that.
You've never wondered that?
But all you're doing is pointing out my inattention, because I certainly should have wondered that as many times as I've seen this film, right? I mean, you're right. He says it very quietly. So
like maybe that woman who comes to check on him and finds his dead body, she was like ear up to the wall, maybe.
I suppose that's possible, but we're not really told, right? I mean, that's a very good question, and arguably a plot hole.
Plot hole. Can't be considered the best movie of all time now.
Yeah.
And you heard the Sight and Sound, that poll that's done every decade. I believe it's done like 2002, 2012. So I think the next one might be next year, where it's like all the major critics, they pick their best films of the year, and for like 5 decades, number one was always Citizen Kane. But do you know what bumped it up? What bumped it to number 2 in 2012? The movie that took number 1.
Was that's an international poll, as I recall, right? Was it Rules of the Game?
It was Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah. So 2012, the latest one. So I guess they'll have another one maybe next year. Citizen Kane dropped to number 2, and Vertigo went to number 1, which, in my favorite director, I love Vertigo. I would not put Vertigo in my top 5 favorite Hitchcock films. It'd be in my top 10. That always strikes me as interesting, that Vertigo is the go-to best film of Hitchcock's career, best film ever made. I've always kind of, okay.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I would have to think of that too, because I think I'd at least put Rear Window above.
Yeah, I mean, I would put probably, I mean, maybe it'd be 5. Above Vertigo, I would do Strangers on a Train, Rear Window, Psycho.
So yeah, I
Maybe
would
The
put Psycho.
Birds. Oh,
Yeah.
and The Lady Vanishes is so great from 38.
Uh-huh.
So maybe it'd be around number 5, but it's not even my favorite Hitchcock film. And this poll, it's the number 1 movie of all time. I'm like, okay,
Yeah, yeah,
do
I'm
it.
with you. I also love. I've got a real soft spot for Marnie, which nobody talks about.
Marnie,
I
yeah.
I really like Marnie. Maybe I just like Sean Connery, right?
Yeah, Marnie came out in 64. That's kind of considered outside of maybe Frenzy from
Mhm.
72. I get to talk about a Hitchcock movie next year for the podcast. I'm so excited about that. Like one of his last really strong films would be 64's Marnie. The only time he worked with Sean Connery, the same period where Connery was Bond. So that's kind of weird. You're like seeing like the way he looks in the Bond films. He kind of looks in Marnie. And
True.
Tippi Hedren, such an underrated actress, so great in The Birds and then in Marnie. And that's a whole nother conversation for us that we'll have another time about the Tippi Hedren, Alfred Hitchcock relationship, yeah. Which has been like, you know, I've had people on my podcast who don't really watch Hitchcock movies because of what went down with Tippi Hedren. And that's a long conversation about, you know, some directors acting badly at certain points in their careers. And you're kind of like, well, do I write them off? Do I not, you know, do I still not consider Hitchcock my favorite director? That's been a tough one for me, you know?
Yeah, my take on that has always been, not to derail that, art, particularly film, involves a lot of players. And if we start condemning the art based entirely on the actions of one
person on a couple films,
I mean, because arguably you're going to find somebody who did
something bad,
misacted on virtually any film,
any movie.
and at what point, obviously the director plays a very important part, but what if it's the cinematographer? Is that an important enough role that we can't appreciate the film? What if it's the lead actor or the lead actress? You know, it seems odd to me. Like Mel Gibson's another person that comes up. It's like, well, I don't think I'm gonna hate every Mel Gibson movie. I'm going to accept the fact that he was an actor portraying a character, and that's what this was. But you're right, it's a difficult conversation. I mean, if Hitchcock were working today in this environment,
might have been canceled.
He wasn't well liked necessarily in the industry at the time, but yeah, imagine what it would have been like today.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard other actresses come to his defense who said he treated me professionally every second of the shoot. And there's just this one, I've read a few biographies on Hitchcock. There's this one little period where he really, became interested in Tippi Hedren as more than an actress. And it's like, there's some stuff I've read in those biographies. I'm just like, oh my God. I mean, he did some monstrous things around 64. And it's like, come on, man, what are you doing? But yeah, some of these other figures, Woody Allen, Forrest, is another one who has a huge influential period of films in the 70s, the focus of my podcast. And I am, I'm like, how do I deal with that moving forward?
Woody Allen is a really troubling character. And I have always tried to, separate the artist from the art, but there does become a point where that's difficult to do. And Woody Allen and Hitchcock are people where it is difficult because they are so invested in the final product, right? Like Woody Allen's films,
written and directed every film.
Wonderful performances, but the performers would not have created those films without Woody Allen. So it's difficult.
I mean, if I'm still doing this podcast in 2027, I feel like I have to talk about Annie Hall, which we'll get to, but something to think about. But thinking about people like Woody Allen and Alfred Hitchcock, just such amazing, careers that lasted 30, 40 plus years for, just went on for decades. And then you have Orson Welles, going back to Orson Welles and kind of wrapping up our conversation here for us, talking about Orson Welles' career. As I said before, he kind of later on in life thought maybe I should have just one and done Citizen Kane and just gone back to theater, maybe gone into writing books and things, like maybe done other stuff, because he makes a lot of films. He acts in a lot of projects from the 40s to the 80s, all the way to his death. And really, I mean, looking at his list, there's so many films, a lot of Shakespeare adaptations I've never seen. I mean, the best of his work, I'd say, outside of Citizen Kane, the other movie he directed that I really love is not The Third Man, Touch of Evil from '58 with Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh. Another really innovative movie in terms of its camera work and its look. And Orson Welles plays a whole different character in that than he is in Citizen Kane. I mean, he's almost unrecognizable in that movie. Have you seen Touch of Evil?
You know what? I haven't seen Touch of Evil.
Oh, okay. If you're interested in Orson Welles, that to me is like the other, well, maybe Magnificent Ambersons too, because he made it right after, Citizen Kane, even though it doesn't end the way he intended it to. And that's been a talk. I want to say just in the last 6 months, I read there's someone who's trying to find the lost print of Magnificent Ambersons 80 years on. Maybe it's in a basement somewhere in South America. Someone's actually actively looking for us right now to see if they can find it. Good on you. Hopefully one of these days that would be huge. And people are like, there's no way. But actually recently in the last 10 years, someone found a lost print of Metropolis, a silent film from the 20s, and they restored it with new scenes and new footage that everybody just assumed was lost. So it is not impossible that there is a print, because there is talk that when he was shooting something in South America, Orson Welles, that someone sent him a print of Magnificent Ambersons before they removed the footage. And so there's this thinking that there is a print of that version of the movie in South America somewhere. Sure. So it's possible it's out there.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting if it popped up.
Yeah. And then I love his performance in The Third Man, which he did not direct. He just acted in that one. Same with Jane Eyre. There's a great adaptation of Jane Eyre from the 40s where he's Miss Rochester. And then The Stranger is a film he directed in '46 that I watched. It was on Netflix like 2 years ago. Like they don't have any movies from like before 1950. I mean, it's hard to find classic films on Netflix.
It is.
But The Stranger was there. It's from '46. It's not as good as Kane. But it's like an interesting story. He's in that too. So check that out. Any other films of his that he's been in or directed that you've seen? Like I tried to watch that 70s movie that Peter Bogdanovich and some other people finally put together, The Other Side of the Wind, that finally got released for us on Netflix in 2018. Like they found the footage that he had shot over the course of many years with different people, and they compiled it into a movie, but it's you can't follow it. It's like it's like an interesting artifact more than it is a movie.
Yeah, the only one I was going to mention for sure, you already mentioned, is The Third Man.
Yeah.
I mean, I think his portrayal of Harry Lime in that is pretty outstanding. I actually remember him more probably from when I was a kid, like popping up on TV series and things like
or cameos.
He did
movies.
Magnum PI at one point, where he'd pop in and things like that. And with Orson Welles, as much as I love Citizen Kane, I'm almost of the mindset he is, where I think it would have been better if he stopped trying so hard. Maybe it had just settled in and been an actor.
Yeah.
Because he's a fine actor, and I think from same thing what you were talking about and the things I've heard, the movie game became so hard for him after the fallout of Citizen Kane, that one gets the sense he was always sort of striving to do what he did with Citizen Kane, but was never really going to succeed.
Yeah.
In part because the deck was stacked against him, right? It's he had sort of a high profile failure, which wasn't a failure, I was going to say through no fault of his own, but I mean, obviously there is some fault of his own because he was the one who decided, that he was going to launch a thinly veiled attack on one of the most powerful media figures of the age. But
yeah, maybe he should have saved Citizen Kane for like his 5th film.
It seems to me, yeah, if you're going to do that, even if you're going to claim, hey, this isn't really about this super powerful, like, I guess the thing would be like, Brian, you or me getting carte blanche to make some huge film, and who we're going after?
Bill Gates.
Zuckerberg. Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, perhaps even more, right?
Or Jeff Bezos.
yeah, exactly. We're gonna think of the most high profile, wealthiest individual in the country with control over a lot of media access, and that's our target.
That's our target. Every moment of those 2 hours, we're gonna attack this guy, make him look just awful.
It's hard to rebound from that. So I kind of think, after his follow-up wasn't exactly what he wanted it to be, that maybe just settling in and being an actor was the better route for him to choose. But what do I know? I mean, he's Orson Welles, right? He'll be in history books.
Yeah, and I feel like I'll talk about him a little bit more throughout the 70s. I feel like he pops up in things here and there. He's in Catch-22, directed by Mike Nichols, like the ensemble film from 1970. He plays a supporting role in that, and I'm sure he'll pop up again. And it's hard to say that his life, that it was a sad story, or I mean how many people can say they wrote, directed, produced, acted in a film as good as Citizen Kane, even if it's just the one film? I mean, that's a huge success story, I think. I mean, I don't look at his life as being, negative or.
Yeah, I don't think it was terribly sad from what I know. I mean, he did, and he continued to be a well-known personality and an actor. He would, people knew who he was. So you get the sense, or at least I get the sense, he probably could have done a lot more. Had he.
So that's what's sad. Yeah.
Had he started with a different film, had he, had he not decided to attack one of the most powerful people in the nation, right out of the chute. When you look at his radio career, his theater career, it seems there was a lot more in him, but like you say, many people never get to the point that he got to. So
especially at that young of age too.
Right. Yeah. So I wouldn't call it terribly sad.
So kind of wrapping up here for us, like, my last question about this film would be, like, what kind of influence do you think Citizen Kane had over cinema over the last 80 years? Like, why does this movie play such an integral role in the world of movies?
Well, I mean, I think it's had a tremendous influence. I mean, you talked about, it was William Friedkin, right, coming in and dissecting it.
Talking about how much it inspired him as a filmmaker, and inspired so many young filmmakers too.
Yeah, I mean, when you get filmmakers going back, and even if they're, somebody who's 20 years old today, if somebody tells them, hey, Citizen Kane's a great film, and then they go back and watch it, they're probably not going to be as astounded by some of the camera shots and things that you've described as somebody would have been in 1941, because now they've seen so many filmmakers over the years replicate it. But one reason a young person's not going to be as astounded is because filmmakers did immediately start replicating the things they saw, right? So I think he changed the way cameras moved. I think he changed angles, like you described that sequence with the table, right?
Yeah.
So
editing.
I mean, I think he just did a lot of really impressive things that other filmmakers have been studying for years. Even like that montage shot we talk about, that you talked about, where Kane and his wife are sitting at the table, and they keep getting further and further apart. Not thinking about camera angles, shots, anything like that. Little montages like that, where you give people a lot of story in a short amount of time. I think filmmakers have latched onto that, right? And said, hey, this is a great, we need to establish this relationship between these characters, but we don't have 30 minutes to do it. How do you do it? Well, go back and look at Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the influences like that are just you can't argue that they're not there, because they are. I mean, it's one of those things when you ask a question like that, it's hard, Brian, because people do that with music, right? They'll say like, what was the influence of Chuck Berry on guitar? And I'm saying, like, you know how you would really answer that? By finding an alternate reality where Chuck Berry didn't exist, because there would probably be a lot of other things you love that disappeared if you take him out. And I think the same thing is probably true of Citizen Kane, right? If we found some reality where Citizen Kane was never made,
or it was destroyed by Hearst,
yeah, there's probably a lot of other movies that either don't get made or that significantly change, that aren't as impressive. Would some other great artists come up with equally inventive stuff at some point? Sure, but you know, who's to say how that trajectory works, right? When does somebody else discover the things that Orson Welles discovered in Citizen Kane? You know, it may be years before we start seeing, you know, some of the things that he's done in that film. So.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a treat for us to talk about one of the great movies of all time, Citizen Kane, with you. I was hoping we could get to an hour, and we've almost gone 2. So thank you. So thank you for doing this for me. This is our longest chat, and one of my favorites I've done for the podcast so far. This was a lot of fun to talk about this really important film with you. Makes me want to go back and watch it again. I'll watch Peter Bogdanovich as a commentary on the DVD I've never heard. So I might take a look at that. I think he might have some insight into this movie too. But yeah, so for those of you who haven't listened to some of our other episodes, we've talked about Monty Walsh. We've talked about Little Big Man, the best president movies. We talked about Inauguration Week in January of 21. And we talked about Escape from the Planet of the Apes. And I know you love vampire movies, for us. So I think I think the next episode, I've got one in October. That's a vampire flick. I think it'll be time finally to talk about a vampire movie with you. I know you love them.
I'm there for that. Yeah, it's actually been a while since I've really delved into vampire movies. So, but I do love them. Yeah. So I'm really excited to have an excuse to go back in and watch some vampire.
Maybe Hearst wouldn't have tried to destroy Citizen Kane if there had been some vampire stuff in Citizen Kane.
Charles Foster Kane should have been a vampire.
That would have Hearst would have said, "Oh, that's fantasy. I won't touch it. It'll be." It would have been a different film. Yeah. But thanks again, Forrest, for being here. Do you have anything you want to promote, or anywhere our listeners can find you online?
You know, lately I've been writing some reviews for a great publication called Highbrow Magazine.
Okay.
So anybody wants to look me up there, please do. And even if you don't want to look me up, check out Highbrow Magazine. It's a lot of fun. It's on the web. They have some great content, and I think that's it. Otherwise, Brian, thank you. It's always great to talk film with you.
Always fun to chat movies with you, Forrest. I concur. So thanks again for being here. Thanks to all of you for listening. We will catch you next time on Film at 50.